A narcissist does not exist in isolation. Their sense of self, their identity, and their feeling of significance are not anchored in their own internal landscape. They are almost entirely dependent on the reactions of others. This is what is meant when we say a narcissist lives from resonance. Imagine a person standing in front of a vast empty hall. When they speak, their voice echoes back in faint, hollow waves. They cannot fully hear themselves or find their presence meaningful without the reverberation. For a narcissist, people, especially empathetic individuals, serve as that echo. Their admiration, their attention, their willingness to absorb and validate experiences all act as mirrors reflecting a desirable self-image back to the narcissist. Without these mirrors, their world feels strangely incomplete. The resonance is not merely about attention, it is about emotional energy. A narcissist instinctively senses who will provide it and who will not. Empaths, by their nature, are attuned to the emotional currents of others. They understand, feel, and respond deeply, often with patience and care. To a narcissist, this makes empaths a particularly rich source of validation. An empath's willingness to invest emotionally, to forgive, to tolerate inconsistencies and even cruelty is interpreted as a steady, reliable supply of energy. The narcissist does not just want to be liked, they need to be mirrored in a way that sustains their self-perception. They measure their worth not by internal criteria, but by the reflection they perceive in others. This dynamic creates a subtle but powerful dependency. The narcissist unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, learns to anticipate the empath's reactions, to manipulate, charm, or provoke them in order to maintain the flow of energy. Every compliment, every moment of attention, every gesture of care becomes a kind of fuel, and over time the empath becomes central to the narcissist's emotional ecosystem. Their moods fluctuations, and even their boundaries are calibrated around the presence and responses of this mirror. The narcissist does not necessarily understand or care about the empath's experience in the same way the empath experiences theirs. They are primarily focused on sustaining their own reflection, their own sense of importance. This is why the act of closing the door, when the empath finally stops providing that mirror, is so disruptive. The narcissist experiences not merely disappointment, but a fundamental interruption of the system on which they rely. It is as if a power supply is cut off without warning. Without resonance, the narcissist confronts an internal vacuum they have long avoided. The absence of validation does not automatically create insight or self-reflection. More often, it triggers a combination of confusion, frustration, and attempts to restore the lost energy. They may seek new sources of resonance, reach out, charm, manipulate, or even attempt to provoke guilt to reopen the connection. But the key point is that their internal world is profoundly destabilized the moment the empath's reflection is withdrawn. Understanding this helps us see the deeper dynamics of narcissistic behavior. It is not simply arrogance or malice. It is an intricate survival mechanism built on external validation. The narcissist is not empty because they are bad. They are empty because they have learned, consciously or unconsciously, to outsource their sense of self to others. The empath, who naturally absorbs and responds to emotional cues, provides the illusion of wholeness. When that connection is removed, the narcissist must face an inner emptiness they are ill-prepared to navigate. Interestingly, this dependence also reveals why narcissists often struggle to form authentic reciprocal relationships. Because they rely on resonance to feel real, they rarely develop a robust internal sense of identity. Their relationships are transactional in a subtle way. They give what is necessary to maintain the reflection they need, but they rarely engage in the kind of mutual vulnerability that characterizes deep emotional connection. The empath, on the other hand, offers the possibility of a more genuine relational exchange. This dynamic explains the intense, sometimes addictive pull between narcissists and empaths. The narcissist craves the mirror, while the empath may be drawn to the narcissist's charisma or emotional intensity. Finally, recognizing that a narcissist lives from resonance empowers the empath. It clarifies that the patterns of exhaustion, manipulation, and imbalance are not caused by the empath's shortcomings. They are structural. The empath is not failing by stepping back. They are simply withdrawing the energy that the narcissist has relied on to sustain an unhealthy system. In doing so, the empath may face resistance, anger, or attempts to re-engage the old patterns, but they also reclaim the capacity to preserve their own energy and boundaries. The moment the empath closes the door is a powerful recalibration, revealing the true dynamics of dependence and highlighting the importance of internal self-resonance over external validation. In short, understanding that a narcissist lives from resonance illuminates the psychological mechanics behind their behavior, the intensity of their need for validation, and the transformative power when an empath finally steps away. It is not just about cutting contact. It is about confronting a system that has long been unsustainable, and it is in that confrontation that both disruption and potential growth can occur. Boundaries are one of the most misunderstood concepts in human relationships. They are not walls meant to isolate or punish. They are markers of self-respect, signals of what we can give and what we need to protect in order to preserve our own integrity. In the context of a relationship between a narcissist and an empath, the act of closing the door symbolizes exactly this: the establishment of firm, non-negotiable boundaries. For the empath, the door represents a choice, a conscious decision to stop tolerating manipulation, overextension, or emotional exploitation. It is the point where self-preservation meets clarity, where empathy is no longer confused with self-sacrifice. In a typical dynamic, the empath gives and gives, often unconsciously, because they are attuned to the emotions of others. They feel the needs, the discomforts, the desires of the narcissist deeply, and they respond almost instinctively. Over time, this responsiveness becomes a habit, a default mode, and often the empath's own needs are placed aside or minimized. For the narcissist, this creates a sense of predictable supply. The empath's boundaries are porous, their tolerance seemingly limitless, and the narcissist's demands are met with patience and compliance. The relationship thrives, not on equality or mutual respect, but on the imbalance between giving and taking. The door, then, is not merely a physical metaphor. It embodies the moment of self-recognition for the empath. It is a realization that their energy, attention, and emotional labor are finite resources. The act of closing the door is a profound acknowledgement that it is both possible and necessary to protect those resources. This boundary is not about punishing the narcissist or seeking revenge. It is about reclaiming agency. When the empath says, whether silently or openly, "I will no longer allow myself to be drained or controlled," they are creating a space where their own life can expand again, independent of the narcissist's needs or manipulations. From the perspective of the narcissist, the door represents something far more threatening. For years, they have relied on the empath's flexibility, patience, and compassion to maintain their sense of significance. When the door closes, the predictable source of validation, admiration, or attention disappears. This absence is destabilizing because it confronts the narcissist with the limits they have never learned to respect. Boundaries in this sense are not simply physical or verbal markers. They are a direct challenge to the system on which the narcissist has built their emotional life. They expose the dependency the narcissist has on others' compliance, revealing a fragility beneath the facade of control and confidence. The symbolism of the door also highlights the empath's power, not in the sense of domination, but in the sense of autonomy. To set a boundary is to assert one's right to self-preservation. It is a conscious interruption of a long-standing pattern. It sends a clear signal. Your behaviors, your manipulations, your demands cannot continue to dictate my life. The empath is, in this moment, reclaiming not only their energy, but also their dignity. This reclamation is transformative because it reorients the empath's relationship with themselves. They learn that their empathy is not a tool for self-erasure, but a quality that can coexist with self-respect. It is important to understand that boundaries are not static. The door is a dynamic metaphor. It can be opened or closed with awareness, depending on whether the environment is safe and reciprocal. In a relationship with a narcissist, however, the empath often discovers that reopening the door leads to a cycle of depletion and manipulation. Once the empath recognizes the patterns, the act of closing the door becomes permanent, not punitive. It is a refusal to continue participating in a system that erodes their well-being. Psychologically, the door also represents a turning point in self-identity. For the empath, closing the door is not an isolated act. It is the embodiment of self-recognition. It is the moment when empathy ceases to be a liability and becomes a strength that is protected, channeled, and respected. The empath learns that true connection is not measured by how much one can tolerate, forgive, or absorb, but by the quality of presence and the integrity of boundaries. This realization transforms the empath from someone who loses themselves in the emotional currents of others into someone who navigates relationships with conscious intention. For the narcissist, this boundary is a mirror they may not want to look into. The closed door forces a confrontation with the consequences of their behavior. It exposes the over-reliance on external validation and highlights the absence of internal stability. The narcissist may respond with anger, attempts at persuasion, or emotional manipulation, trying to reopen the door. Yet the door itself, once firmly closed, is a symbol of the empath's inner strength and the impossibility of sustaining the old dynamic. It is both a challenge and a limit, an invisible force that cannot be bargained with or circumvented. In essence, the door symbolizes the balance between self-care and relational responsibility. It teaches a profound lesson. Empathy is a gift, but it is not meant for endless sacrifice. Boundaries are not walls against connection. They are the structures that allow healthy relationships to exist. When an empath closes the door, they are not only protecting themselves, they are modeling what it means to engage in relationships with integrity, respect, and conscious awareness. By setting boundaries, the empath transforms a relationship from a one-sided energy drain into a reflective moment of clarity. The door communicates what words alone often cannot, that self-respect and emotional safety are non-negotiable. It is a powerful statement of agency and an assertion of the empath's right to exist fully without being defined or diminished by the narcissist's needs. The closed door is both an ending and a beginning. For the narcissist, it is a confrontation with absence. For the empath, it is an entry into autonomy. Boundaries, therefore, are not merely rules. They are the architecture of freedom, the framework through which personal strength and emotional intelligence are expressed, and the foundation upon which healthier, more balanced relationships can be built. When an empath finally closes the door on a narcissist, it is often accompanied by silence. This silence is not empty. It is charged with meaning. For the empath, it is the absence of constant emotional labor, manipulation, or negotiation. For the narcissist, it is an unfamiliar and often unbearable void. The silence functions like a mirror, reflecting back to the narcissist a reality they have avoided for years, the reality of themselves, unmediated by someone else's attention, approval, or emotional validation. It is in this silence that the first seeds of inner confrontation are sown. A narcissist's life is typically structured around external feedback. They have learned to measure their worth, their importance, and even their identity through the responses of those around them. Compliments, attention, admiration, concern, or even fear, all of these serve as metrics that shape how they perceive themselves. When an empath, who has often been the primary source of this reflection, withdraws, the narcissist encounters a startling absence. There is no applause, no emotional response to manipulate, no attentive mirror to bounce off. In this vacuum, the narcissist is confronted with the raw, unfiltered presence of their own mind and behavior. This is disorienting because, for much of their life, the narcissist has been shielded from self-reflection. The empath, in their patience and compassion, often absorbs or accommodates the narcissist's moods, justifications, and manipulations. In effect, they have acted as a buffer between the narcissist and the consequences of their own actions. When that buffer disappears, the narcissist experiences a kind of psychological shock, a sudden awareness that their patterns, previously sustained and validated by external attention, now exist in isolation. The inner confrontation that arises from silence is not pleasant. At first, it manifests as confusion and agitation. The narcissist may feel an urgent need to restore the connection, to re-establish the flow of validation. They may attempt to charm, coerce, or provoke, trying to break the silence that is forcing them into introspection. This is not necessarily conscious. It is an instinctual response to the withdrawal of the energy they have relied upon. The silence functions like a spotlight, illuminating the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are when unobserved. For some narcissists, this confrontation is fleeting. The instinct to seek new sources of external validation is strong, and they may quickly move on to another person who will provide the same mirror. The silence is thus temporary, and the opportunity for genuine self-reflection is lost. They continue to live in a feedback-dependent loop, rarely learning from the absence but instead seeking to replace it. However, for others, silence can act as a catalyst for deeper awareness. The absence of external resonance forces the narcissist to grapple with questions they have long avoided. Why do people eventually walk away? Why do I feel empty when no one is validating me? Why does the reflection I rely upon seem to vanish so easily? These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the foundation of the narcissist's identity. They demand acknowledgement of vulnerability, dependency, and the consequences of emotional exploitation. In this sense, silence becomes a crucible, a space in which the narcissist must confront the parts of themselves that have been hidden behind charm, manipulation, and external attention. The intensity of this confrontation is magnified by the fact that it occurs internally. Unlike external feedback, which can be denied, rationalized, or redirected, silence exposes the narcissist to their own internal narrative without interference. There is no empath to absorb the tension, no mirror to soften the reflection. The narcissist must contend with the quiet, unmediated truth of their emotional habits, their relational patterns, and their reliance on others for self-definition. This can provoke anxiety, fear, or even anger, because the silence is both accusatory and unyielding. It demands self-awareness. Paradoxically, this silence also carries a subtle invitation. It invites the narcissist to develop internal resources they may never have cultivated, to learn to self-reflect without external validation, to feel grounded without constant attention, and to confront the discomfort of being alone with one's own thoughts and behaviors. For those willing to endure it, silence offers a chance to cultivate authentic self-awareness, something that external mirrors can never provide. The challenge is that many narcissists resist this process, often fleeing back into relationships where their need for resonance can be satisfied. For the empath, the silence is liberating. It is not empty but full of space for their own growth, energy, and self-reflection. Whereas the narcissist experiences silence as deprivation, the empath experiences it as restoration. The empath learns that the absence of manipulation or emotional drain is not a punishment, it is a return to balance. The silence allows them to reconnect with their own needs, desires, and boundaries, which had often been overshadowed by the narcissist's constant demands. In this way, silence serves a dual function. It is both a mirror for the narcissist and a restorative space for the empath. In the end, the inner confrontation provoked by silence is a profound illustration of relational dynamics. It reveals the dependence of the narcissist on external validation and the power of the empath to assert boundaries. It demonstrates that absence can be more transformative than presence, that withdrawal can catalyze reflection where confrontation often fails, and it underscores a fundamental truth. Growth, self-awareness, and transformation cannot be forced. They arise only when the structures that perpetuate avoidance are removed. Silence, therefore, is not passive, it is an active agent of change. It destabilizes old patterns, exposes hidden dependencies, and creates space for introspection. For the narcissist, it is uncomfortable, disorienting, and potentially transformative. For the empath, it is liberating, protective, and regenerative. By understanding the power of silence, we begin to see that closing the door is not just an act of boundary setting. It is a profound catalyst for psychological and emotional awakening. When an empath finally closes the door on a narcissist, it is tempting for outsiders to view the act as conflict or confrontation, as if it were a battle between two opposing forces. Yet in reality, this departure is not about aggression, revenge, or punishment. It is an act of liberation. The door, once closed, does not signal a clash, but a reclaiming of agency. It is the empath stepping out of a dynamic that has long been exhausting, one-sided, and emotionally draining. This departure is a conscious assertion that their energy, time, and emotional labor are finite and deserve to be honored. For the empath, the relationship with a narcissist often feels like walking a tightrope. Every action, word, and emotion must be carefully calibrated to maintain harmony, avoid triggering anger, or sustain the narcissist's sense of importance. Over time, this constant vigilance erodes the empath's sense of self. Boundaries become blurred, and the empath may feel trapped in a cycle of perpetual giving, accommodation, and forgiveness. Leaving, therefore, is not an act of cruelty, it is a reclamation of life. The act of closing the door signifies that the empath is no longer willing to surrender their well-being for the sake of someone else's emotional convenience or self-image. This departure is a form of liberation because it breaks a pattern that has been sustained for years. For the narcissist, the empath's presence has been a steady source of attention, validation, and emotional energy. They have relied on this connection to feel significant, to avoid facing the emptiness within themselves, and to maintain control over the relational narrative. When the empath leaves, this source is cut off. The narcissist experiences confusion, anger, and perhaps attempts at persuasion. But these reactions are not a reflection of the empath's hostility. They are the natural response of someone whose system has been abruptly destabilized. In contrast, the empath experiences relief, clarity, and a sense of regained autonomy. The departure, therefore, is not a war. It is a natural consequence of restoring balance. Beneath the surface, the act of leaving carries a profound psychological significance for both parties. For the empath, it is an acknowledgement that self-care is not selfish. It is the recognition that empathy does not require self-sacrifice to be meaningful. By closing the door, the empath asserts the value of their own inner life, their emotional health, and their dignity. This is a transformative moment because it shifts the locus of power from the narcissist, who has relied on the empath's responsiveness, to the empath themselves, who now exercises conscious choice over their own engagement. For the narcissist, the departure is a confrontation with absence and loss. They may attempt to reinterpret the situation as unfair, to manipulate the empath into reopening the door, or to cast blame. Yet these reactions cannot alter the fact that the empath has set a boundary that is firm and non-negotiable. In this sense, the departure functions as a mirror. It forces the narcissist to recognize that their previous behaviors, their reliance on external validation, and their manipulations have consequences. While it is uncomfortable, this confrontation is necessary for the possibility of any authentic self-reflection. Liberation, then, is not only for the empath, it is a subtle invitation for the narcissist to consider change, though such change depends entirely on their willingness to confront themselves rather than the empath. The idea that departure equals liberation is rooted in the distinction between reaction and choice. Leaving is not a reactive, emotionally charged outburst. It is a conscious decision grounded in self-awareness. The empath does not act out of anger, spite, or revenge. They act out of recognition that their emotional energy cannot be endlessly expended on someone who depletes it. This conscious choice transforms what might appear to an outsider as abandonment into an intentional act of self-preservation and empowerment. In essence, the empath is not leaving a person, they are reclaiming their own life, space, and emotional sovereignty. Moreover, this liberation has ripple effects. Once the empath steps away, the relational dynamic is fundamentally altered. The narcissist loses their predictable source of attention and emotional fuel, which disrupts old patterns. Simultaneously, the empath gains space to heal, grow, and reconnect with aspects of themselves that may have been suppressed. Freed from the demands of constant emotional regulation for another person, the empath can rediscover their own desires, boundaries, and identity. This freedom is not just psychological, it is existential, offering the empath a chance to live in alignment with their values, needs, and authentic self-expression. It is important to note that liberation does not necessarily imply forgiveness, reconciliation, or continued connection. The empath may choose to maintain distance indefinitely, and this is consistent with the principle that liberation is about reclaiming autonomy rather than exerting control over the other person. By leaving without malice, the empath models the highest form of self-respect, disengagement without aggression. This is profoundly different from conflict-driven breakups or retaliatory actions. It demonstrates that the act of leaving can be a source of empowerment, clarity, and self-realization rather than hostility. Finally, the liberating nature of departure highlights a broader truth about human relationships. Connection should not come at the expense of one's own well-being. Empathy is a powerful force, but it must be paired with self-awareness and boundaries. When an empath closes the door, they are embodying a principle that often takes years to fully grasp. That true freedom arises when we honor both our capacity to care and our right to protect ourselves. Liberation, therefore, is not just the absence of the narcissist, it is the presence of the empath's regained power, clarity, and emotional sovereignty. The act of leaving transforms what may have been a cycle of exhaustion into an opportunity for growth. It is a declaration that one's inner life matters, that boundaries are sacred, and that self-respect cannot be compromised for the comfort of another. This is why the departure of the empath is not a war. It is the opening of a space in which freedom, self-realization, and authentic living can flourish, untouched by manipulation or control. When an empath finally closes the door on a narcissist, the event is often viewed externally as a simple ending, a withdrawal, a departure, a termination of the relationship. Yet beneath this surface lies a profound potential for transformation. The act of leaving is not merely an emotional reaction or a cessation of interaction. It carries the latent power to initiate change, both in the empath and potentially in the narcissist. This keynote reminds us that endings are rarely inert. They are catalysts, and the absence of old patterns can create space for reflection, growth, and self-awareness. For the empath, the act of departure is the first step in a deeply transformative journey. Relationships with narcissists are often characterized by chronic imbalance. The empath gives, absorbs, and accommodates, while the narcissist takes, manipulates, and relies on external validation. This dynamic, sustained over time, erodes the empath's sense of self, energy, and even emotional clarity. When the door is closed, the empath is no longer caught in this cycle. They are freed from constant recalibration, emotional labor, and the pressure to maintain the narcissist's self-image.